Uh, Today, I will be introducing our moderator, Ms. Leila Alarian. Uh, Ms. Ariane is a Washington, D.C. based journalist and executive producer of Fault Lines, an award-winning current affairs program on Al Jazeera English. Her body of work has been given a number of prestigious awards, including two news and documentary Emmys and a Peabody Award, Robert F. Kennedy Award in journalism, an Overseas Press Club Award, and the list is too long for me to keep listing all of them. I want to highlight one of her very recent works that was published in the New York Times, opinion piece, "My Grandfather Bought a Home in Gaza with His Savings and Israeli Airstrike Destroyed It." I was really impacted by that piece, and I thank her for raising her voice at a time when everybody was very concerned about Gaza. Ms. Alarian, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Brother Uwais, for that amazing introduction. I did ask you to make it short, so thank you. It's an honor and pleasure to be here with this amazing panel. Thank you to the audience for being here as well. I just wanted to make quick introductions to the panel, and we'll hear from them, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience. Starting out, we have Phyllis Bennis. She directs the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, focusing on the Middle East, U.S. wars, and the UN. In 2001, she helped found the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights and now serves on the National Board of Jewish Voice for Peace. She has served as an informal advisor to several top UN officials on Middle East issues and was twice shortlisted to become the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory. Among her books, her 11 books that she wrote and edited is Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. We will hear from Phyllis Bennis now.
Thank you very much, Leila. And thank you to everybody who was involved in the conference. Thanks to CIGA and the university, and to the translators who always work very hard at these events. If we're going to talk about the relationship between US foreign policy and its impact on the Palestinians, one of the easiest ways to start is to go back to 1967. Not at the beginnings of the Zionist movement, where the US was also involved, not at the beginnings of the creation of the State of Israel and the resulting Nakba for Palestinians. But in 1967, right in the context of the Six-Day War, it was a military decision. It was in the Pentagon that there was a recognition that the Zionist fighters, the Israeli fighters, had done a pretty good job at winning this victory in a very short time. And their view was, we could do business with these people. And military business became the central component of what came to be known as this special relationship between Israel and the United States. I'm not going to trace that whole history through the Cold War, how Israel operated as a kind of cat's paw of US imperialism around the world, not only in the Middle East, but that was certainly part of it, providing arms to countries where it was inconvenient at various points for the United States to be publicly arming various dictatorships. But the result was the beginning of a process in which really unlimited economic and military and diplomatic and political support went from the United States to Israel in all the years since. Among other things, it helped protect Israel from ever being held accountable in the United Nations or later in the International Criminal Court. It helped to build up Israel's economic wealth. Israel, of course, depending on which sources you use, the CIA or the IMF, they have different assessments, but whichever one you use, it's somewhere between the 23rd, 24th, or 27th wealthiest country in the world. And crucially, in building up Israel's military power and its nuclear arsenal. So through all of that process, the United States was very crucial in enabling Israeli crimes that were war crimes, crimes that were violations of international human rights law, violations of international humanitarian law. And this was through the provision of military aid, which of course in recent years has been about $3.8 billion a year as a starting point, and then usually between 1 and 3 billion additional over the course of each year for things the Israelis use up and want replacement. The kind of protection I mentioned at the United Nations is a constant. And this has been true even when people in the United States are hurting, even when we have 140 million people who are living under the poverty line or just one emergency away from dropping below the poverty line. Aid to Israel is sacrosanct. It is never touched. The US policy, though, we have to be clear, is a policy towards Israel. The Palestinians are the victims of that policy, but they're not particularly the subject of that policy. If Israeli governments at some point decided that their version of Zionism wasn't working and that they really needed something that, whatever they called it, would not involve the destruction of Palestinian lives that allowed Palestinians to return to their land that was based on equality, the US would be fine with that. The Palestinians are not the subject of that policy. Israel is the subject, and what Israel wants is the basis for that policy. So when we look at where US policy towards the Palestinians is today and how it impacts Palestinians, we have to start with understanding what that policy is vis-a-vis Israel. So for the Biden administration, they came into office saying, we're not going to make foreign policy in general a priority. Our priorities are dealing with the pandemic and dealing with the economic crisis. Secondary priorities have to do with infrastructure and labor and some other things, maybe climate, maybe immigrant rights. But foreign policy was really not on the list until, as things happen, they have to deal with it because the US, despite some weakening of its power as an empire, is still the most powerful government in the world, the most powerful economic force in the world. So it has to take into account changes in the global situation. So what does that look like? In terms of immediate policy towards Israel and Palestine, Biden had made clear from the time of his campaign that he did not necessarily agree with Trump's extremist levels of support for the most extreme right-wing forces within Israel. So when Trump said that he was going to move the US embassy to Jerusalem, that he was going to close the consulate in Jerusalem, that he was going to recognize Israel's illegal annexation of the Golan Heights as somehow legitimate, that he was going to say that settlement construction and expansion are somehow not violations of international law. All of those things, Biden made clear he didn't necessarily agree with, but he had no intention of changing them. So they have become Biden's policy. Whether he wants to acknowledge it or not, they are his policy until he changes them on the ground. He is accountable for those policies. So that's where the Israeli side, on the relationship with Palestinians, there are parts of the policy that relate directly to the Palestinians. Biden made a few changes. He started again paying US dues to UNRWA. He opened the PLO office in the United States, reopened the consulate in Jerusalem, but no change, crucially, no change in the relationship to Israel. The $3.8 billion a year in military aid remains. The refusal to call for an immediate ceasefire when Israel was not ready for a ceasefire in the recent conflict, none of that has changed. That is still Biden's position as much as it was Trump's position and the position of presidents before that. So what is different now? What's different now? What's facing the Biden administration, and crucially, what's facing those of us who work for Palestinian rights from outside government, is that there has been an enormous shift in the United States on the public and media and ultimately policy discussions and debates about the question of what policy should be towards Israel and Palestine. The discourse has shifted dramatically. Now, that didn't all just happen in the last few months. This has been an effort that's been going on for 2 decades or more, a very concrete, very specific, targeted effort by an increasingly powerful movement led by Palestinians, but also involving lots of other people involved in lots of other movements across the United States, fighting for Palestinian rights, and having some pretty amazing results, so that the question of supporting Palestinian rights is now much closer to the mainstream position. We know that the International Criminal Court is now investigating Israeli crimes as well as United States crimes in areas of their occupations. And the debate about apartheid has come to an entirely different new level. So what are we seeing right now in terms of US policy? There's obviously a new government in Israel that is not particularly significant in terms of any sort of a change. It's united around two things. One has already been accomplished, that is getting rid of Netanyahu as the prime minister. The second thing that they are united on, which they probably don't acknowledge, but functionally it works this way, they are united on the understanding that the current situation in Israel is perfectly sustainable for Israeli Jews. If you're an Israeli Jew, the situation in which you live is quite fine. There are problems on occasion, but nothing that can't be dealt with. Your passport is good all over the world. You're living in a wealthy country. For Jewish Israelis, democracy is thriving in Israel, as we see from this last election. It's a little chaotic, but still, it's thriving. The problem is, of course, that if you're living under Israeli rule and you are not an Israeli Jew, whether you are a Palestinian living under military occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, or East Jerusalem, if you're a Palestinian living under second and third class, fourth class citizenship inside the 48 boundaries of Israel, or if you're a Palestinian anywhere in the world who is a refugee denied your internationally recognized right to return to your home, the situation is not so sustainable. So the new government in Israel is not likely to change anything in terms of policy. What may change, and this could be quite dangerous, is that some in the United States are looking at the coming to power of a new government in Israel, particularly of a new prime minister, and saying, oh, I'm so relieved, because Netanyahu was kind of embarrassing. His extremism made it very difficult for liberal Zionists, for instance, to keep supporting Israel. For members of Congress who needed an excuse to tell their constituents why they have to continue supporting Israel and refusing to support Palestinian rights, it was harder when Netanyahu was the prime minister. So now there's a new guy coming to town. Great. Now, the fact that the new guy is actually further to the right than Netanyahu himself is not really playing much of a role in that thinking. It's a new name. He will have a different style. He will have a different approach. He probably will try to return to making support for Israel a bipartisan approach rather than one that is limited to the Republican Party, as has been increasingly the case in the last few years. That will be different. So that could be quite dangerous. When you had somebody in Israel who looked like a clone of Donald Trump, despite the fact that he was taking those positions before Trump came on the scene as a political actor in the United States, it was more difficult for liberals and even for centrists, for Democrats, because of the antagonism to the Democratic Party that Netanyahu was so willing to show, along with his disdain for democracy, his disdain for the media, all of those things. So what we're now looking at is that some people will really be prepared to welcome Bennett and Lapid as a rebooting of US policy towards Israel, even though there has been no change. That's going to make some of our work harder. But in terms of the actual political positions, I don't anticipate any significant change. The new government is still going to oppose the United States' efforts to return to the Iran nuclear deal. The JCPOA is still anathema for the Israeli government. There will still be no willingness to even acknowledge, let alone accept any accountability for war crimes. There will still be no concern about human rights. We can anticipate that the percentage of people convicted in Israeli military courts will remain above 99%. I don't think any of that will likely change. For Israeli Jews, will it change? Will it not? I don't think anybody knows yet, and it's not particularly my concern today relative to what it's going to mean for Palestinians. So what are Palestinians facing right now in this new set of conditions? They now are continuing to face military occupation, the siege of Gaza going into its 15th year, the continuation of house demolitions, evictions from Jerusalem, the effort to carry out continued ethnic cleansing, particularly in and around Jerusalem, the constraining of access to Palestinian land, the new nation state law that says explicitly for the first time, making it legal, to say that only Jews have the right of self-determination in the state of Israel. No one else, no one who is a citizen of Israel has that right unless they are Jewish. All of that remains unchanged. Gaza remains uninhabitable, as the United Nations said it would be starting last year, and it certainly is uninhabitable now, despite being inhabited by over 2 million Palestinians. The COVID crisis has made everything worse, particularly in Gaza. The Israeli assault last month, of course, destroyed the one laboratory in Gaza that was able to do COVID testing. So the situation has gotten demonstrably worse. So that's what we're looking at as we approach this question of what are these changes that we've seen in the last 20 years. So we've seen, of course, new members of Congress starting in the 2018 elections, where a number of champions of Palestinian rights, including the first Palestinian American woman, Rashida Tlaib, came into the Congress, as well as the first Somali refugee, Ilhan Omar, and others who explicitly support Palestinian rights, who were explicitly prepared to challenge the Israeli treatment of Palestinians. And in some cases, they began to identify it as apartheid. The work against military aid to Israel has been underway in the US for 25, 30, 35 years, but it's taken on a new resonance in the recent period. The BDS movement that was launched, of course, by Palestinian civil society in 2005 changed the conditions so that it was not only about military aid and economic aid earlier, but it's also about giving a direct way for people in the United States to participate in that movement, whether it was students boycotting Sabra hummus or enormous, powerful economic actors like the major retirement funds of major church denominations in the United States, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, a host of other denominations who began the process of pulling their money out of corporations who were profiting from apartheid and occupation. So this kind of divestment has been on the rise across the United States. And now we have the normalization of the discourse around apartheid. Again, this is not something new. 20 years ago, we were debating whether it was the right time to start talking about Israeli apartheid. Palestinians have been talking about it from before that. South Africans have talked about it from before that. Suddenly, we're hearing it coming from members of Congress, from faith leaders, in the mainstream media. Ironically, of course, we used to hear about it from Israeli government officials who would talk about it as a threat, that if we don't do something to change, we are going to face a situation that looks like apartheid. Well, it looks like apartheid. It looked like apartheid back then as well. And whether they were prepared to acknowledge it or not, plenty of other people did. But now we're seeing something different. The level of seriousness with which the new reports about apartheid are being taken is just one example of how this discourse shift is playing out. So we've seen just in the last few months, I think everybody listening here today is aware of these new reports. We had the Human Rights Watch report, Human Rights Watch being perhaps the most influential human rights organization based in the United States. They operate globally, but they have always been very, very cautious, very careful, very, some might say, timid in their willingness to critique Israeli practices. Over the years, they've had an extraordinary staff who have pressured the leadership to let them go public with what they knew was happening on the ground. And finally, they won that battle and issued an extraordinary report that makes clear that with all of the Israeli violations, that in the occupied territory, in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, it does count as apartheid. We had the Israeli B'Tselem organization, again, probably the most influential internationally of all of the many important Israeli human rights organizations, issuing a report around the same time, which went even further than Human Rights Watch. Even the title of their report that talked about From the River to the Sea. This is about a regime of Jewish supremacy. And they said, this is apartheid from the river to the sea, an even more powerful indictment of the Israeli violations. Then we had a couple of years ago, but getting new attention now, a report that was done for the United Nations, for the Economic and Social Commission of West Asia, that was put together by Richard Falk and Virginia Tilley, that went even further than either of those, that said that Israeli actions constitute apartheid against all Palestinian people, whether or not they are in Israel or the occupied territory, because it's a crime against people, not against particular territory. So we have these various definitions, various versions, but a unifying and increasingly important and influential understanding that what Israel is guilty of is the crime of apartheid. And that is a crime against humanity. So when we came to the recent conflict, the recent crisis in the last couple of months, the crisis that erupted over the evictions of Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah in occupied East Jerusalem, the attack on Al-Aqsa Mosque on the holiest day of Ramadan, and especially the 11-day assault on Gaza. This was not new in Gaza. The Israelis, of course, call it mowing the grass. They have to do it occasionally to keep Gaza in line. But it was treated differently. We saw members of Congress, not only the champions of Palestinian rights this time, but people with a broader, more centrist approach were also willing for the first time to challenge that refusal of the Biden administration to call for an unconditional and immediate ceasefire. So we had a call from 12 Jewish members of the House of Representatives demanding a ceasefire when Biden was saying no. 29 members of the Senate also calling for a ceasefire from his own party. 500 former staffers of the Biden campaign who went public with an extraordinary letter where they said that we need to work to end the underlying conditions of occupation, blockade, and settlement expansion that led to this exceptionally destructive period in a 73-year history of dispossession and ethnic cleansing. 500 parts of Biden's campaign staff. That was extraordinary. These are not people who have been involved in struggling for Palestinian rights for 20 years. This is all new. And it means that things are changing dramatically. A brand new columnist in the Washington Post, one of the most influential newspapers in the United States and traditionally one of the most pro-Israeli papers, it's gone through a lot of changes already. But the newest columnist in his inaugural column focused on Palestinian rights. And what a surprise, the sky did not fall. Nothing happened. It was treated as normal. So we see these new possibilities. And I want to end with the understanding of how we're seeing these new possibilities. We're seeing the possibility of military aid to Israel not being ended immediately. That's not going to happen this year or next. But we do have the possibility that for the first time, we may be able to impose end-use requirements that say explicitly that this money may not be used for things like Israel's military juvenile detention system, the only country in the world that has a military system to detain children as young as 12. And to say, finally, no, US funds cannot be used for that. These are all possibilities now because the work of changing the discourse has moved to the political level. The question of apartheid is publicly on the agenda, not quite where it was around South Africa's anti-apartheid movement at the end, but certainly in the earlier years of that 60-year-long struggle that South Africa had to wage. We are seeing Palestinians far along in that process, and it's a very exciting moment, despite the horrors on which Palestinians on the ground are living. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Phyllis. That was a masterful summary of decades of US policy in the region. It was really an amazing presentation, and there's so many questions I know that I have and the audience has. But we'll go to Vince Warren. Vince is the Executive Director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, which I have the honor of serving on the board of. He oversees CCR's groundbreaking litigation and advocacy work using international and domestic law to challenge human rights abuses, including racial, gender, and LGBT injustice, Under his leadership, CCR successfully challenged the NYPD stop and frisk policy in profiling of Muslims, ended long-term solitary confinement in California's Pelican Bay prison, and the torture of prisoners in Abu Ghraib prison. And for CCR, justice takes a fight. And I encourage you to check out CCR's incredible work, including on Palestine. Vince.
Thank you very much, Layla. It's wonderful to be with everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful, wonderful program. As Layla mentioned, I'm the executive director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, and I want to start off my talk about white supremacy and Zionism from the perspective that I was in 3 years ago. 3 years ago, I was detained by the authority at Ben Gurion Airport for leading what would have been my second delegation of US-based civil and human rights activists and lawyers to Palestine. And through a variety of mishaps, I guess is probably the best way to think about it, that I was detained for several hours, and I was removed from the country. And to be clear, that I was not being held in military detention, and I was not being held in criminal detention. I was not held overnight. I still had my American passport, which even during that challenging time, I realized could function as a get out of jail free card for someone who was not Palestinian with a United States passport. And I was held in an administrative detention center that's designed to house 40 people. And while I was there, a number of thoughts occurred to me. And one of them was, of course, that being detained is just an occupational hazard of human rights work. But the other thing that occurred to me was, as a Black man who has spent all of his life trying to only visit US jails and prisons on civil rights and human rights delegations and not being placed in them by the authorities, it was both jarring and enlightening to be a Black man in an Israeli detention center for a couple of reasons. Reason number one, and most importantly, was for every moment of my detention, I was aware of how privileged I was with respect to how Palestinians have been treated and continue to be treated in terms of jail, military detention, torture, beatings, and so on. And the other thing that occurred to me was how strange that an African-American man who fights for civil rights and fights against white supremacy in the United States could be so easily deterred from bringing that perspective to Palestine and also bringing people to the perspective of Palestinians. The delegation that I was leading with the Center for Constitutional Rights brought lawyers and advocates who are experts in their field in the United States on issues of immigration, issues of criminal justice and attacking the criminal system, prisons, Native American rights and sovereignty. And the idea behind the delegation was to be in my lane. My lane is all of these horrible things are happening on a daily basis. And where is the outrage in the United States amongst the most powerful civil rights leaders that we have? Every time that there is a police killing, every time that there is a immigration policy that puts kids in cages on the U.S. in the U.S. border, these lawyers and advocates can reach their constituents and reach their legislators and to make a tremendous fuss about how this is not democracy, this is not the rule of law, and we should not be living like this. And yet these same leaders, like myself not too long before that, were largely ignorant of what was happening in Palestine. And even if we were not, we were cowed, we were nervous, we were concerned about how critique of Israeli policy would play out in the US context. So my role was largely to bring the people to Palestine so that they could walk the land with Palestinians, with Palestinian and Israeli human rights organizations to see for themselves what military detention, how it operated, to go through the various checkpoints, to be searched, to be pulled off of buses, all of which we were, and to be hassled coming in and out of the airport, just to be able to give a flavor, a small sliver of a sense of what the daily life for Palestinians continues to be, and what are we in the US prepared to do about it. The trips were largely successful. This, as I mentioned on the second one, I was not allowed into the country and I was sent back to the United States. But what I can report back from the people that did make it, the rest of the delegation made it in 2018 and I led one in 2016, was that folks who have seen everything in the United States, that have done death penalty work, that have been litigating on behalf of men in solitary confinement, that litigate the horrible conditions and treatment of men in Guantanamo, that litigate, that continue to litigate for what's left of whatever rights Native Americans have in the United States, have never in their lives seen what was happening in Palestine. And what I mean by that is it is all eerily reminiscent of things that we continue to work on in the United States. And it is also eerily reminiscent of the white supremacist mechanisms that cause us to do this work and cause our people to be oppressed. But to be able to see such a wide-ranging, all-encompassing mechanism and structure of repression that is buoyed and supported and advanced through the so-called rule of law was something that none of the 40 people that I've managed to bring through had ever seen. When thinking about white supremacy, it's important for us to not confuse its expressions with its genesis. And, you know, my view is that white supremacy is actually a fairly hard thing to define. I'm not an academic, so I don't get paid by the hour to define things. I'm a human rights lawyer, and I mostly interrogate them, pull things together, and then let you know what I see. But it seems to me that white supremacy is a bit like gravity, that it's less important how you define it, but it's more important how it operates. And the historical context in the United States is allowing folks to be able to connect with the Palestinian cause in ways I think are reminiscent of the way that it's been going on for 40 or 50 years, but with a clear resonance now because of the discussions, because of the battles and the reckonings that we're having in the United States that moves people to action. Phyllis did an extraordinary job of talking about US complicity with respect to policy, and also talked about the generational shifts that are happening in terms of how folks in the US are actually having conversations about Israeli apartheid. But I want to focus on a new generation of organizers and activists, which we can call the Black Lives Matter generation, for lack of a better term. And these are folks that have moved into action in the United States largely since 2014, when Trayvon Martin was killed. Recently, the New York Times published a major work observing the 40th anniversary of the arrival to the United States of kidnapped Africans who were enslaved. It was called the 1619 Project, and the series of essays examined our history since 1619 and chronicled how every part of our society, every part, has been touched by American slavery. One powerful piece within those set of documents posited that because of this, Black people in America were not merely passive beneficiaries of the eventual American democracy. Rather, we were key to forming this democracy. We were key to challenging the nation's legally sanctioned cruelty with our integrity, with our resistance, and with our action. However, beneath this important view of this peculiar institution of slavery lies another older one that demonstrates that the institution was not peculiar in the least. Prior to 1619, colonial settlers in the United States enslaved thousands of Native people as their lands were stolen, and as the evidence indicates that enslaved Native people were sold in exchange for enslaved African people starting that year. Native people too fought back with their integrity, resistance, and with their action. And although the methods of resistance of Native and African people might have varied widely in the US context, what they were fighting did not. whereas many Black people were kidnapped, relocated, and forced into servitude by companies with the support and encouragement of the government, many Native people had their land stolen, were kidnapped, relocated, and forced into servitude by the government with the support and encouragement of companies. And it's this retelling, this resurfacing, this unwhitewashing of US history has, I think, really touched a nerve with respect to young Black organizers, with respect to young Native organizers, and with respect to young recent immigrants. And I think it's important because the framework is no longer trying to understand how to get through, how to translate, how to transcend oppressive structures. What is happening now with this current generation is that they have a clearer understanding of how oppression has worked. They are spending their time unearthing the narratives that have been erased in the telling of the history of white supremacy in the US context, and they are making those narratives known now, and it is a basis for their action. And anytime, as we know from the Palestinian context, certainly, that you can use a true historical narrative as a basis for current action, it means that resistance and moving forward strategies are done not for the purpose of trying to politically reach people where they are. This is about reaching people where they should be. It's a massive education project. And I think what has happened in the United States has been because Native folks, because, as we call them, BIPOC folks, that would be Black, Native, Black, indigenous, Native, and people of color, because our cohort of younger folks see the world in this way, it is much easier for them and much more in reach to be able to see how this operates in the international context. So I don't think that I'm telling tales out of school by saying that in the United States, the level of support for the Palestinian cause is certainly as high as it's ever been. And I think as Phyllis was demonstrating with respect to the recent boldness of some members of Congress, there's an express call for that if you consider yourself a US progressive legislator, you have to be progressive on Palestine as well. The idea that if you're against bans, borders, and walls in the United States during the Trump administration, you have to be against bans, borders, and walls with respect to Israeli policy. And this has resulted, in my view, in many conversations that I'm having with not only an allegiance, but a deep alignment and, frankly, a deeper understanding of the Palestinian experience from people that have never been to Palestine before. You don't have to tell Black people what suffering looks like in another context when they can relate it to their own intergenerational trauma and intergenerational suffering. They know it when they see it. And so these delegations that have been happening, the conversations that have been happening have led US advocates to think more stringently about how white supremacy operates in the United States, to demand an acknowledgement of that and to demand accountability for that. And it is translating into deeper, more unconstrained support of the Palestinian cause. So, one of the places that I wanted to shift to was to talk about the question of policy and mythology. And I've been reading Professor Ibram Kendi's book, where he makes the case that that we're really not talking about racist ideas that get formed into policy. What we're talking about are racist policies that get shored up and justified through racist mythology and narratives. And in order to think about white supremacy, I think that there, in every context, including the Palestinian context, there are certain mile markers that I think are important. One is that in order to be a white supremacist, you have to construct whiteness. You have to construct it, you have to make it up, you have to define it as you and not the other clearly. And then you have to pretend that that is part of the natural order of things. That you use this constructed whiteness as a lever to take land and to take resources from people who are not white. You use state and economic power mechanisms to codify whiteness and to erase what came before. You create mythologies, grand mythologies that criminalize those who are non-white and those who seek to advance and defend the rights of those who are non-white. And then what you end up doing is you can defend the mechanisms that you put in place and not the underlying racism. And then you repeat that process. And I say that because what has been so interesting in the debates that are happening in the United States around Israeli policy is that a lot of the locus in up to this point has been around whether Israeli policy is reasonable in light of the right of Israel to exist. And one of the narratives that is gaining traction, which is something that people in the human rights field know and something that you all know, but it bears repeating in both the Black and in the Palestinian context, is that states do not have rights. People have rights. What states have are power. And the essential balance here is between the rights of the people that they're supposed to have, either by domestic law or by international law, and how that circumscribes and pushes back on the state from wielding its power. And so one of the things that younger organizers are less inclined to believe than perhaps people that have been around for 10, 20, 30 years, they're less inclined to believe that democracy is a freeing enterprise. They're less likely to believe that people will be free, people will get free, as they put it, through the mechanisms of formal democracy. And that the reason for that is because historical study shows that not the democratic principles, but the way that the democracy is practiced in the United States and in Israel is one that, the way that it's practiced is one that assumes, that bakes into a notion of fairness, the idea of white supremacy. There is literally no way to vote your way out of an occupation. There is literally no way for enslaved people to vote themselves out of slavery. There is no way for people in cages on the southern border to vote their way out of cages. And so younger folks have less of a fealty towards democratic principles than they do towards revolutionary strategy. And by revolutionary strategy, what I mean is really transformative strategy, that the idea that if you're transforming systems as opposed to just fighting them, as opposed to just reforming them, but transforming them, that is the endeavor that that is the 50-year endeavor that we're all on. And for those of us that have been in the field for a while, we are inclined to think more practically and pragmatically. I personally think that's because we tend to try to solve problems and to conceptualize and solve problems within our lifetimes. And if we think about what a 100-year strategy is, we think two things. One is that people will be suffering for 100 years. Many of those years will be under my watch. And number two, that what's my worth in this battle if I can't make a meaningful contribution to it? And I think that younger folks have a longer view of the strategy, but they have a shorter timeline for their expectations, which is great about young folks. So what they're demanding is that they're demanding that Palestinians, and in the US context, be surfaced and be treated in the same way that we talk about Black folks and repression against Black people. In 1822, in Florida, the U.S. was at war with the Seminole tribe, the native tribe in Florida, which is a peninsula surrounded by three sides in water, the Atlantic Ocean, the Gulf of Mexico. And during those Seminole wars, African Americans who fought with the Seminoles, enslaved African Americans who signed up with the Seminoles, and Seminole Indians were slaughtered. They were beaten, they were tortured, they were burned out. And in fact, what ended up happening was both coasts around the coastline, this beautiful beach land in Florida, was essentially settled by American or US settlers. And in 1822, they had a problem because they had relocated the native folks to the center of the island. All of the commerce was on the perimeter of the state, and they had essentially created a buffer of Native Americans between the commerce that was happening on the East Coast and the West Coast. And so this is a scenario, this is a story that's not told in US history, but what it practically means, and there are analogies in terms of the way that Palestinian land has been taken, is that the idea is that it never actually stops until Black folks or Palestinians are erased, because what the president did at the time was he asked Congress for additional troops to move the Native American folks from the center of Florida so that commerce could flow easily between white people on the coasts. And the debate, when you look at the congressional discussions, were that this was a perfectly rational, reasonable thing to do with respect to the burgeoning and developing economy of Florida. And what it actually did was it put the nail into the coffin of the both the integrity of Seminole culture, but also for the people, to the point now where people in Florida only think about Seminole Indians as mascots. And this is the lesson that Black activists are taking to their fight internationally. The idea that the erasure of, that white supremacy tends to erase the true stories of how people were marginalized and criminalized. They're seeing that very clearly in the context of Palestine. Social media has made conversations much easier for Black folks and Native folks and Palestinians to talk. And as a result, then, when I think back on my little time in the jail in Ben Gurion Airport, and I'm looking on the walls, and what you have on the walls, for those of you who have never been, I'm sure some of you have, is that you have graffiti that's written in soap, and a lot of it is in Russian. Some of it is in Arabic, and some of it is in English. And the one that I couldn't read the Cyrillic, but I could read the one that was in English, and it said, "Palestine will be free." And my takeaway about this generation of organizers and their orientation towards white supremacy and the role of challenging white supremacy in Palestine is that those of us who manage to be deterred, manage to be detained, can still, even in the belly of the mechanism, declare clearly and unequivocally that Palestine will be free, because we see our own humanity and our own freedom tied up deeply in the freedom and humanity of Palestinians. Thank you.
Thank you, Vince. That was really powerful and inspiring. And again, so many questions, but we will leave that to the end of the panel. Next, we have Esty Chandler. Esty is the founding organizer of Jewish Voice for Peace, Los Angeles, which was launched in 2010. She hosts and produces the long-running Middle Eastern focused radio show on KPFK, along with Negwa Ibrahim, and is the executive producer, co-creator, and host of the Middle East Minute, a joint project of KPFK and Jewish Voice for Peace, with a 2-minute daily primer about a few important things or perspectives going on about the Middle East that listeners will not hear from major corporate news outlets that day. Esty, it's so nice to meet in this way and in this conference.
Thank you very much. My thanks goes to the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, to Professor Sami Al-Arian for organizing. It's an honor to be part of this incredible conference and to be presenting along with this esteemed panel. The recent ratcheting up of violence by Israeli police, border, and military forces projected Israel's entrenched occupation and siege back onto the world stage in large format and in high definition. In Hollywood, we often say timing is everything. So Israel doing so, as the world is still digesting those recent detailed B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch reports explaining how and why Israel is guilty of the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution, produced some different reviews than past Gaza assault episodes. But the violence wasn't only meted out by police and military entities. Hundreds, if not thousands, of far right-wing Israelis from both inside the Green Line and from the hundreds of illegal Israeli West Bank settlements joined the police and military, and were also seen on that stage looking like the kinds of violent, angry mobs that the world knows well. And these were waving Israeli flags. Lastly, Israel's violent responses to peaceful protests around Israel and in the West Bank in places like Lod and Sheikh Jarrah, in addition to the 2021 version of Israeli bombing of densely populated neighborhoods and civilian targets in Gaza, put one entirely new troupe of players and voices on that world stage as well, as they explained every event leading up to and during the 11-day assault in real time and in context. And that troupe featured Palestinians. As fewer and fewer people consume their information from mainstream media outlets, more and more people are understanding that understanding what the American and Israeli governments would like the world to believe is a clash between Israel and Hamas for what it actually is: a US-supported, highly militarized, and nuclear-powered apartheid regime ruling over Palestinians with impunity. But let's remember how we got here, because the rise of the hard right the world watched starring in that Israeli movie is not a new plotline. Journalists and political scientists have been documenting the far-right ascent in Israel at least since the lead up to Netanyahu's now ended 12-year run as prime minister. And as Peter Beinart pointed out on his Substack blog, in Netanyahu, one finds the key elements shared by many populist autocrats that currently menace liberal democracy around the world. The first is resentment. Like many popular autocrats, Netanyahu sees himself as an outsider. The second is his faith in capitalism. Among his proudest professional accomplishments is helping turn Israel from a socialist economy to the neoliberal startup nation Israel projects itself as being today. The third, Beinart wrote, like many hyper-nationalists, Netanyahu portrays himself as uniquely strong enough to prevent his people from being preyed upon by foreign powers. Fourth, like Donald Trump, Indian Prime Minister Modi, Hungarian Prime Minister Orban, and others, Netanyahu defines his country not as comprising everyone who lives within the borders, but instead as representing a particular ethnic, religious, or racial group. And fifth, like demagogues across the ages, Netanyahu has long been obsessed with propaganda. Beinart also wrote about a shadow debate that he understands Netanyahu to have conducted with Barack Obama about the course of history that I think is pertinent to this conversation. He wrote, throughout his presidency, Obama kept telling Netanyahu that Israel's control over millions of stateless Palestinians was unsustainable. Obama believed it unsustainable because the world, as discussed, is becoming less and less tolerant of colonialism and racism. Obviously, positive change doesn't move forward in a straight line, but like many, Obama loved to quote Martin Luther King saying, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Netanyahu, the son of a revisionist historian, sees the world very differently. During a 2015 discussion at the American Enterprise Institute, Netanyahu told the audience that they should read all 12 volumes of Will Durant's The Story of Civilization. And in doing so, Beinart surmises that Netanyahu was answering Obama, in essence challenging Obama's theory of progress and saying the future doesn't belong to liberalism, as Obama defined it, including tolerance, equal rights, and the rule of law. But instead, the future belongs to authoritarian capitalism, governments that combined aggressive and often racist nationalism with economic and technological strength. And so the future, Beinart believes Netanyahu was implying, would produce leaders who resemble him, not Barack Obama. What is new over these last dozen years or so is that all of our metadata, our interactions, our likes, posts, and purchases are being collected and sold to fuel a $1 trillion per year industry. Today, data is worth more on the open market than oil. As the film The Great Hack documents, companies like Cambridge Analytica are using our data points to help their clients meet their goals. And their clients' goals are obtaining political power to make money. Big tech's targeting tools are their weapons, and their targets are consumers who also happen to be voters. Voters whose minds they have good reason to believe they can change, because as that film documents, they have done just that all over the world and with great success. As Professor Shibli Telhami recently wrote at Brookings, as more and more light is focused on Israel's apartheid rule over Palestinians, and as democratic attitudes towards Israel are shifting, including among younger Jewish Americans, Israel's focus has also shifted to the evangelical right as a cornerstone of US support for Israel. His polling shows evangelical attitudes towards Israel account for most of the Republican Party's support. In fact, without evangelicals, Republican attitudes on Israel deviate little from the rest of America. But interestingly, there may not be a future for Zionism there either, as recent surveys continue to show younger evangelicals are much less supportive of Israel than older evangelicals, and by a widening margin. In fact, support for Israel among young evangelicals has dropped from 75% to 34%. Where Israel is thriving is farther right, on the far and extreme right. Back in 2017, Naomi Dan, then Jewish Voice for Peace's media manager, was writing about Israel's embrace of white supremacists, like Charlottesville March leader Richard Spencer, who had been invited to speak on Israeli TV. The Israeli TV host asked Spencer how he, as a Jew, should feel about Spencer's platform. And Spencer responded that as an Israeli citizen, someone who understands their identity, who has a sense of nationhood, peoplehood, history, and the experiences of the Jewish people, they should respect someone like Spencer because he too cares about his people and wants them to have a secure homeland for themselves, just like that host wants a secure homeland in Israel. And he said he sees himself as a white Zionist. And that wasn't the first time that Spencer had compared his disturbing white nationalist vision to the Zionist project. And this disturbing alliance between Zionists and white nationalists lived in the White House during the last administration, certainly emboldening both camps. And just like there are and have long been fascists marching in the streets of America, there have long been fascists marching in the streets of Israel, beating up Palestinians and leftists. Ex-Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak commented that the events in Charlottesville reminded him of fascism in Israel and cited the example of Lahava, an anti-miscegenation gang that frequently attacks Palestinians. As another former JVP staff member, Ben Lorber, wrote about in January, the US white nationalist movement's admiration for Israel's supremacist values fits comfortably with its deep anti-Semitism, as right-wing ideologues can easily combine anti-Semitism with a pro-Israeli stance. In 1895, Theodor Herzl, Zionism's founding father, predicted that, quote, the anti-Semites will become our most dependable friends, the anti-Semitic countries are allies, end quote. This is because anti-Semitism and Zionism intersect structurally, and as both depend on a collective politicization of Jews as the other, and current dynamics have made that horrifying alliance impossible to ignore. Lorber explains that for these right-wing groups in the United States, Israel has become a symbol for a set of values, an entire worldview. His research for Political Research Associates finds that different parts of the US right use Israel as a canvas on which to project their own fantasies of nationalist chauvinism, Christian redemption, white pride, and anti-Semitic conspiracism. And surprisingly, none of the fantastical scripts that they project on that screen turn out well for Jews, for Palestinians, or for prospects of a just peace in Palestine and Israel. For the ascendant forces of right-wing populism in the United States and as well as around the world, support for Israel takes on a special intensity. In those spaces, Israel is celebrated as a frontline defender of Western civilization in its crusade against radical Islam. As Lorber writes, Israel is viewed as a nation that embodies the strong arm of xenophobic nationalism, militarized masculinity, unapologetically pushing back, invading ethno-religious others, expanding its territory, and protecting its heritage in bold defiance of a chorus of liberal outcry. As Palestinian writer Nada Elia put it, the Israeli and the US right share a desire to establish and maintain a homogeneous society that posits itself superior, more advanced, and more civilized than the others who are unfortunately within its midst, a demographic threat to be contained through border walls and stricter immigration law. A robust Israeli-American conservative nexus projects Israel as in revolt against a globalist world order of open borders and international homogenization. And many across the global far right use Israel as the example, as they insist that strong nations must retain their sovereignty, police their borders, preserve their identities, and reject the meddling of international bodies and human rights standards. Meanwhile, for millions of right-wing Christians, philo-Semitism and an almost fanatic love for Israel is infused with what Lorber describes as, quote, fever dreams of an apocalyptic end-time scenario where the Jewish state is plunged into cataclysmic war and its ingathered Jews are forced by a resurrected Christ to convert or perish, all while the triumphant Christian faithful are raptured to heaven, end quote. As postdoctoral scholar, writer, and editor Denis Jalzhezhik wrote last year, Christian Zionists are not alone in their support and admiration of Israel. Right-wing and far right-wing movements and political parties across the world also idealize Israel as they view the Zionist colonial project of developing countries, seizing on ultra for the perpetuation of anti-Muslim bigotry, white supremacist, and other racist ideologies, as well as other far right-wing movements intersect in their adherence to Zionism. Israel has been quick to make friends with new right-wing governments wherever they've emerged. And Zhezhik points out that Israel has long positioned itself within the global political right, and particularly under Netanyahu, who proudly collaborated with the far right, even glorifying some prominent far right figures as great friends of Israel. As many have noted recently, this philo-Semitic Christian Zionism carries deep undercurrents of anti-Judaism, accentuated by their increasing tendency of many believers to wrap themselves in Jewish religious garb and iconography. In fact, on the morning of the January 6th insurrection, a group of Christian right-wing leaders held a Jericho march, the name itself invoking the biblical narrative of a group of warriors laying siege to a walled city, while they were on the streets of Washington, calling on participants to pray, march, fast, and rally for election integrity. In other radical corners of the US right, support for Israel is also increasingly mixed with open anti-Semitism, creating a complex ambivalence. For various groups that make up the US militia movement, driven by a combination of Second Amendment paranoia, New World Order conspiracies of tyranny, and anti-government libertarianism, and staunch support for Trump, Israel is often respected as an impressively hyper-militarized society, aligned with the United States on their imagined battleground against a demonic totalitarian other. Lorber also reports a similar ambivalence displayed by the Proud Boys, an misogynistic fraternity notorious in the Trump era for entrenched street battles against anti-fascists. Perhaps because that group's Western chauvinism fits comfortably with Israeli hypermasculinity, a Proud Boys Israel chapter formed in 2018 and was quickly tokenized by the US group to bolster its image of diversity. Simultaneously, a blend of white nationalists have mingled in Proud Boys circles, and for them, anti-Semitic, anti-Zionism tends to reign supreme. In one recent example, a white nationalist named Kyle Chapman claimed to lead a breakaway Proud Goys faction of the group, referring to the Hebrew term for non-Jews, and pledging to confront the Zionist criminals who wish to destroy our civilization. A popular unofficial Proud Boys channel on the messaging app Telegram, meanwhile, carries multiple posts decrying wars for Israel in the Middle East, which it claims are supported by Israel First politicians who are disloyal to America. Yet, despite all evidence, and despite long aligning itself with the global right, Israel is still supported by most liberal and left-leaning politicians in the West, likely due to entrenched Orientalism. And Israel is more often than not still comprehended by and projected as a liberal democratic outpost in the Middle East, mainstream media outlets. And the result of their to extend nationally here in the US, as well as internationally and beyond political ideologies. As these dynamics reveal, Palestine-Israel has been a central component of regressive right-wing governments, political parties, and movements around the world. White supremacists, anti-Semites, neo-Nazis, and religious fundamentalists continue to find inspiration in Zionism for many purposes, whether their goal is to conceal anti-Semitism, further racist policies, or to trigger an apocalypse. As long as they praise the Israeli government, they will likely continue to be accepted by Israel as an ally and continue to find support in right-wing, far-right, extreme right, and fascist right corners across America, lest we make sure that changes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esti, for that incredibly informative and important presentation. Last but not least, we have Iran Efrati. Iran is the Executive Director of RAIA, researching the American-Israeli Alliance, an investigative researcher into the Israeli military. He formerly served as the chief researcher for Breaking the Silence, where he collected testimonies from hundreds of IDF soldiers. He has worked with the International Criminal Court and participated in both independent and UN investigations into Israeli military operations. His investigative reports have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Guardian, among others. Today, his research is focused on international military and police partnerships between the United States and Israel. Iran, take it away.
Thank you so much, Ayla, and thank you for all the incredible work you are doing. I'm following you for many years now, and in awe of the crucial and critical work that you're doing. And thank you all for having me as part of this important discussion. It is really an honor to be participating in this conference alongside you. So, as you've already was alluded to on the panel so far, the US-Israeli alliance at the forefront of the global war on terror is a powerful axis with serious consequences for human and civil rights, both in Palestine, in the United States, and beyond. I want to expand on that now and offer another critical angle on this alliance: the role Israel plays in US empire, both at home and abroad, and specifically how the American security regime works through Israel to fuel domestic militarization. Palestinian researchers and activists shown us for many years that Palestine is a site of experimenting and refining technologies and tactics of Israeli war making that is exported all over the world. The laboratory of an industry that is developing for over 70 years. Today, I want to argue that to fully understand the Israeli military industry, we need to understand the US military industry, because it is actually a single military industrial complex. And this joint military industry is embedded in US racial projects that go beyond traditional war, such as policing. Now, a crucial dimension of this joint military industrial complex operates through joint trainings of US law enforcement with Israeli security experts in what is known as the deadly exchange. For over a decade, I have been tracking on the ground in Palestine delegations of US police arriving to Palestine and learning Israeli security practices and tactics. In 2017, the US-based Jewish Voice for Peace that was mentioned here on the panel launched a campaign called End the Deadly Exchange that aims to end the training of US law enforcement by Israel. This campaign is committed to echoing the Palestinian call for decolonization, with the understanding that what we saw in recent weeks from Sheikh Jarrah to Gaza to Lead is what the Unity Uprising clearly articulating as the Israeli project of militarized policing, one of settler colonialism and ethnic cleansing. And so in the time that I have today, I will shortly break down what is the deadly exchange, who is profiting from it, how is the deadly exchange tied to US-Israeli military industries and the militarization of American police, and why it is so dangerous for equality and justice in Palestine, the United States, and beyond. So the militarization of US policing didn't start, of course, with Israel. It dates back to the US colonialism of the Philippines, occupation of Vietnam, where US military brought surveillance and occupation tactics back to American streets. But with 9/11, we see a serious escalation of this. The war on terror brought with it a new framing of security that required a more expensive and violent government practices against US citizens and residents. And Israel is stepping in this moment to play a significant role worldwide and in the militarization of American civil spaces. So not only police, legal system delegations to Israel, politicians delegations to Israel, alongside the police, these delegations are part of a larger security framed exchanges between the two countries. Now, saying that, it is important to understand what US forces are actually looking for when going to Israel. They do not go to Israel to learn how to be racist or violent, right? They go because they are racist and violent. In Israel, they find an ally, settler colony with a shared mission, motives, and enemy. US policing was always a racial project, but it is refined and developed in Israel through Israeli apartheid. So let's go back to 2002. Just a few months after 9/11, the first delegation of American officials already went on this new version of trips to Israel, included NYPD, LAPD, together with agents of the CIA and FBI, as well as the core crew that will establish ICE less than a year after, and also civil employees, for example, of the MTA, the train system in New York City. In the last 19 years since, hundreds and hundreds of American law enforcement, together with local police departments across the country, ICE agents, border police, transit authorities, SWAT teams, and even university campus security have all traveled together to Israel to learn tactics and strategies under an anti-terror framing. Until today, more than 40 states across the United States and well over 300 police departments from across the country have sent delegations to Israel, with thousands more being trained back in the US by Israeli security experts. So who is paying for all of this? The trips are completely sponsored and funded fully for all participants and serve as the basis for possible promotions and gaining expertise. These trainings are directed off the bat at high-ranking officials set to run a unit or a department and join the decision makers level. The funding itself come from a range of 501c3 nonprofits like the US Anti-Defamation League, to private corporations in the US, and all the way to federal grants and Israeli government grants. And I can talk more about the sponsor, the funding, and connections to specific programs like the 1033 you might have heard about in the discussion if you're interested. So this is how they're getting funded. But what do they actually do there, and with whom? Well, framed as a counterterrorism seminar, the delegations themselves focusing on themes like crowd control during protests and riots, deep surveillance, military weapons and technologies, intelligence sharing, and immigration. The delegations will meet Israeli police officers, but also military personnel, intelligence and security experts at the national airport, in some cases military prisons COs, and political Palestinian prisoners in military prisons, and sometimes even Palestinian police officers that are collaborating with the Israeli military. Now, delegates will be especially interested in understanding how to recruit local players from the community to police themselves. The delegates will witness live demonstrations of Israeli control of occupied Palestinian territories, protests at the West Bank, the command room in the old city in occupied East Jerusalem, and in some cases, even a visit to the Gaza border, where, of course, in recent weeks, Israeli tanks were lined up to shoot hundreds of shells into Gaza, and where Israeli snipers awaited in recent years for protesters with the March of Return. These trainings are happening, of course, at the expense of Palestinians, but they also have dangerous effects that all of us in the US and across the world should be concerned about. In a special report we've researched and wrote for over a year, including tracking and observations of US delegations and interviews of Israeli soldiers and American law enforcement officers who came back from the exchanges, we detailed the three main effects that are coming back to American streets. So, number one, expanding surveillance. This includes a comprehensive visual monitoring in public places and online, and heightening infiltration of social movement and entire communities in the US. One important example here is the demographic unit. I don't know if you heard about demographics unit, but it's an NYPD covert unit, also known as the mosque crawlers, that work to surveil and arrest Muslim and Arab New Yorkers after 9/11. Now, once it was exposed, it was also revealed that it was based on an Israeli military unit called Mistaravim. Mistaravim in Hebrew, meaning being more Arab, looking more Arabs, is basically Arab Jews like myself who's joining units of the Israeli military that infiltrates the Palestinian villages and communities to suppress any resistance to the occupation. Effect number 2 is justifying racial profiling. These trips really help police officers justifying marking Black and brown people as suspect, particularly Arabs and Muslims, and refining the policies and tactics and technologies that target communities and social movements that seek racial justice. An example here we already heard about in this panel is airport security. So specifically the Ben Gurion Airport, which is an important site for all delegates. It's considered the gold standard for airport security, but as some of you experienced yourself, unfortunately, it's simply based on racial profiling. From the moment you enter the airport, Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, people of color are all directly profiled by Secret Service agents and security guards. Today, most airports in the US are using Israeli personnel and technology, and many of Ben Gurion Airport policies and tactics have been exported to all major US airports around the country. And effect number 3, we detailed in our report, is the suppressing of public protest through the use of force. Treating protesters as enemy combatants, viewing protesters in American street as enemy combatants, like Israel, of course, view Palestinian protesting on their land, and controlling media coverage of state violence. There are many examples they witness on these trips, including regularly Friday protests in occupied East Jerusalem, in the West Bank, but maybe an even more telling one is a visit to the Gaza Strip border. So as I said, some delegates go to the border with Gaza where snipers gunned down protesters in the March of Return, including with the Tavor automatic rifle. The Tavor is an Israeli development that replaced eventually the M16 in Israel and is the main weapon in use by the Israeli military infantry today. The Tavor is currently in the hands of police departments across the US after seeing it in action on those trips. But perhaps the most crucial puzzle piece to understand the effect of these delegations is that they contribute to the US-Israeli military-industrial complex. These delegations help facilitate lucrative contracts and deals between the countries, including under the auspices of the US military aid to Israel that Phyllis mentioned earlier. The military aid to Israel, currently the biggest of its kind in the world, is really a mechanism that facilitates contracts between US and Israeli weapon companies and between these companies and US and Israeli governments that generate massive profits, largely subsidized by US taxpayers. To legitimate these deals, contracts are framed as a security necessity, and police delegations help mediate this process. When delegations arrive to the Israeli showroom of occupied Palestinian territory, any corporate deals that come out of their trainings are understood as advancing US national security, with the delegates that just came back as new advocates for Israeli tested products. US companies which supply the weapons as aid to Israel have also facilitated throughout the years massive subcontracts for Israeli weapon corporations, which fueled both industries. For decades, the 24% of the billions of dollars in US military aid to Israel was given in contracts for its own weapon companies, for Israeli weapon companies, which was critical to developing the Israeli military industrial complex into what it is today. But the current US military aid package to Israel is changing the power structure between the two countries. In one of its final acts, in late 2016, the Obama administration signed the latest memorandum of understanding with Israel that came into effect as of 2019, starting a process that will eventually require that 100% of the unprecedented amount of $38 billion in military aid will be used solely for contracts from American weapon companies with ties to the government. So what this means is that American weapon corporation, through their contracts and tender under the US military aid, created an entire market based on the occupation of Palestine. They are earning contracts through the alliance with Israel, and at the expense of Palestinians, they are literally making a killing. Israeli offensives on the Gaza Strip are not only war crimes, they have afterlives in American policing. Throughout the past weeks, bombs dropped on Gaza, the planes that dropped them, the shells that were fired from the land, the missiles from the sea, as well as the grenades and bullets that injured and killed protesters across Palestine, were all made in the US. And the companies who made them already received new fulfillment orders right now. Some of these weapons make their way back into American streets. We have traced Israeli technologies tried for the first time in Gaza during the 2014 offensive, from surveillance devices to machine guns, to the hands of US law enforcement. And we already have new research that in the latest offensive last month, 3 artificial intelligence technologies were tried for the very first time in Gaza. I can tell you the names, but you wouldn't believe me. The official military names of these 3 new devices are the Alchemist, the Prophecy, and the Depth of Wisdom. You can make that up. They will soon eventually make it to the Israeli showroom, and from there possibly to law enforcement around the world. Since the launch of the war on terror, we have seen the US-Israeli alliance develop, policing and military apparatuses melding together, and Israeli tactics and technologies expand their global reach. But we are now in an historic moment of possibility. We are seeing a unity uprising across Palestine and the global movement in solidarity rising to meet the moment. We are seeing a global mobilization against militarism and unprecedented conversations about abolition and justice for people in Palestine, the US, and around the world, as Vince alluded to earlier. In this moment, it is important for us in the Palestine Solidarity Movement to advocate for an end to police exchanges with Israel, which is not only joining in the BDS movement to serve as an international counterweight to Israel's army industry, but also an important part of the bigger call to transform our understanding of security and ultimately build together real safety for communities in Palestine and everywhere. I hope that people that are with us today will join us in the call to end the deadly exchange. And I want to thank you very much for your time.
And thank you so much, Eran. Your work is incredibly important, and the areas you're looking at are so understudied, and it's really making a crucial contribution. So thank you. This has been such an incredibly informative panel, and there's so many questions. I don't even know where to begin, but we'll get right into it. We'll see if the audience has questions as well. I wanted to start out with Phyllis. And Phyllis, first question for you is the fact that the US administration knows that the two-state solution is dead. What do political elites, particularly on the Democratic side, think the end game is, and how will they achieve it?
Wow, that's a big question. I'm not sure I agree with the entire premise of the question. I'm not sure that they acknowledge, even to themselves, that the two-state solution is over and done. There are many Palestinians and many supporters of Palestinian rights who have been critics of the two-state solution for a very long time. Now, it really has nothing to do with that. Is it just or is it not? Is it partial justice? It's that it's over. It's not possible anymore because there's no land left for a serious, viable Palestinian state. There's bits and pieces of land to form bits and pieces of Bantustans, but without any of the criteria of what is a state, which requires independence, requires control of borders, requires contiguity, requires all kinds of things that are just no longer on the agenda anymore. So I think that claiming to still see the two-state solution as the answer provides a very convenient way to maintain the status quo. And as I indicated earlier, I think that despite language to the contrary, Obama's and others, the status quo is quite sustainable for the Israeli state and for Jewish Israelis, the 80% of Israeli citizens who are Jewish. So by talking for those who are not prepared to move in the Netanyahu direction of saying there will be no state on my watch, for others to say we're working towards a Palestinian state. We want two states. We don't have a good partner for peace. There's all these excuses for why things don't change and allowing it to change. I think for those of us who are not in the elites, who are trying to influence them, one of the more effective arguments that we've had recently goes beyond sort of the identification of apartheid, the identification of settler colonialism, that sort of thing, but to say that it's not up to us to say how many states there are. Even colonial and neo-colonial powers don't get to necessarily manage the political arrangements of areas that they control. We have a responsibility for supporting processes towards equality, towards international law, and towards human rights. And it's up to the people who live there, Palestinians and Israelis. You know, I always, when I talk about it, I say to members of Congress or whoever's, I just say, I'm a Jewish girl from California. Why do I have the right to say how many states there should be somewhere else across the world, right? So my job is to focus on the issue of equality, human rights, and international law. That doesn't work with a lot of the elites, but it's increasingly something that is important for people who are looking at the situation and saying, you know, we've been hearing for years about this peace process. It hasn't really gone anywhere. Maybe we need a whole different approach. And what's important, I think, is that now outside of the US, there is a greater understanding and a greater willingness from some governments, I think particularly the government of South Africa and the government of Namibia, but other governments as well, that are recognizing that it's going to take the kind of global movement, global pressure that we saw in the anti-apartheid movement against South African apartheid to create the kind of pressure that will make it possible for other states to impose sanctions on Israel. The United States is not going to sanction Israel. The things that we're talking about are possible, things like conditioning military aid on Israel's abiding by human rights, for instance. When we call it sanctions, it becomes not possible. When we talk about what it means, it is possible. But other countries can talk about sanctions and do. The United Nations can bring back the Special Committee Against Apartheid, can rebuild the former Center Against Apartheid that brought together a staffed office based at the United Nations, whose job it was to produce resources, to distribute them around the world, to convene meetings of anti-apartheid activists from all around the world, to strengthen the unity and the power of the movement, to become an arm of the anti-apartheid movement, the way it was around South Africa. So those, I think, are the kinds of models. Here in the United States, we are working with members of Congress. As I indicated earlier, we have not only these individual heroes, individual champions of Palestinian rights, but more, in some ways, even more importantly, we are seeing significant shifts in the more centrist components of the Congress, parts of the administration, et cetera. And that's where I think over time we will be seeing a shift. But the United States is not going to lead on this. The United States is not going to be the ones to suddenly say, you know what, we were wrong all this time. Who knew? Who knew that equality and human rights was more important than a state? Who knew, right? That's not going to happen. But what we are seeing is that more and more people in the United States are seeing that. And around the world, we're seeing it among both people and institutions and governments. And that becomes really, really important. So I think that's how we have to redirect, in a sense, where we look for leadership. The Palestinian people are going to liberate themselves. No outside supporters are going to carry out their liberation. Our job is to stop our governments, and for those of us in the United States, it's the hardest thing of all, to stop our government from preventing Palestinians from succeeding in their own fight for liberation.
Thank you. And what a daunting job that is. My next question is for Vince. During the 1960s, at the height of the Black Power movement, Black and Palestinian solidarity was very strong. And now we talk about Black Palestinian solidarity as strong once again, but there's not as much analysis about what happened in between. Why do you think there's a breakdown in internationalism after the late 60s, and why do you think it's on the rise again now?
Well, thanks for the question. There's an additional piece to it in the 1960s, which is also that, at least with domestic civil rights, there was a strong connection between Black folks and Jewish folks, particularly with respect to Southern racism. And I'm not suggesting at all that that was the break in internationalism, but I am suggesting that there were very strong bonds that were tied both in religious communities and I think with respect to other emerging nonprofit organizations where Black folks saw their own struggle for freedom and for freedom. It translated into solidarity no matter what. So I think we're emerging from a situation, and we still have these discussions in the civil rights community about the historic connection between Blacks and Jews in the United States and what that means moving forward. I think it's a slightly separate question from the question of internationalism. Just from my perspective, I think that one of the pieces that happened was we became very focused politically in the 1960s, even in 1968, 1969, and the Vietnam War with the question of U.S. Complicity and foreign policy. As we got into the mid to late 1970s and into the 1980s, the politics really shifted in the United States. And so people were more likely to look for jobs in stable, now newly formed nonprofits than they were to lead the revolution and to be connected deeply as internationalists. And so, they call the 1980s generation, which I take great umbrage at, sort of the bridge generation between the radicals of the 60s and the radicals now. I don't subscribe to that either, but I do think a reemergence of internationalism has as much to do with a resurgence of the politics of the anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist politics of the 60s that are now beginning to see themselves take hold in the aughts and in the 20s. It has as much to do with that resurgence than it has to do with anything else. But I'm particularly happy to see it. And I'm particularly heartened by intergenerational conversations that are around politics and not necessarily around issues, because I think it's the politics that define how people look at the issues. And I think in that middle generation, people were focused on issues and not politics, and we're still emerging from that. And I think that speaks a lot to the challenges that Phyllis has mentioned time and again about what we're not going to see, because it's the underlying politics that are still anathema to the mainstream United States power brokers, even though the politics are animating, I think, the broader connection. And one other thing, if I could, I wanted to thank Aaron for talking about the New York City Police Department, and also I think in particular the Anti-Defamation League's role. The Center for Constitutional Rights has been very clear in condemning that piece, and this actually connects to the question of internationalism, because in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and in the 90s, with proliferation of issue-based NGOs. The politics were stripped out of it. And now you have a situation where anybody can call themselves a civil rights organization in 2000 if they're sort of down with certain things. You know, I take the position that the ADL, particularly with respect to the role that it plays in and proudly plays as the largest police trainer in the United States, cannot walk both sides of those streets. You cannot be an organization that is building power in policing at the same time that you're talking about Black Lives Matter. And I also think, although that they don't claim to do this, they claim to do the exact opposite, that they have in their charter that they are, you know, staunchly in defense of the state of Israel. And that is actually the big question in the NGO community right now, is that human rights NGOs, human rights organizations, have to be aligned with people and rights and not with states. If you're aligned with states, you really cannot call yourself a civil rights organization. And I think, you know, so that's a longer-winded answer to the question. I also wanted to point out that in the policing context, it was my organization, the Center for Constitutional Rights, that litigated successfully the Muslim mapping against the Muslim mapping program. And I'll just throw this one piece out. In the court's opinion that found that we were prevailing, the court was looking at the Muslim spying program and said very presciently, in the 1920s, it was the communists. In the 1940s, it was the Japanese. In the 1960s, it was Black folks. And when are we going to see with foresight what we see so clearly in hindsight? And the idea of adding repression against Muslims to the long panoply of white supremacist repression was a really significant act, even if it only occurred in the context of a judicial opinion.
Thank you so much, Vince. I think Phyllis wanted to add something.
Yeah, just quickly, thank you for that, Vince. That was terrific as an articulation of all those complicated factors. I wanted to add just one more to the earlier part of the question about the longstanding Black-Jewish alliance that broke at a certain point after the earlier period of the civil rights movement. And I think one of the things that emerged that was at the core of that doesn't get talked about often enough is the question of class. You know, from the 20s on, when large-scale Jewish immigration to the United States was taking place, Jews were poor immigrants. You know, when my great-grandparents and grandparents came, they were pretty poor. By the time of the late 50s into the 60s, Jews were becoming wealthier and moving out of immigrant-based tenements where they lived cheek by jowl with African-American communities, with other people of color. They were the poor people in the big cities in particular. And when that stopped being the case, when you started having the Jewish community, for a host of reasons I'm not going to get into, became wealthier, moved to the suburbs, you had a break not only geographically, but also politically. So you had historically among the white people who participated actively in the civil rights movement, a high percentage of them were Jews and a high percentage of them were communists. And those two things came together. That didn't last too much longer. After Jews became a much wealthier white community, they discovered whiteness, you know, in each of these immigrant communities. The Irish were not considered white when they first came, etc. Jews were in the same position. They became privileged, moved to the suburbs. Far fewer of them became communists in the 50s and 60s than had in the 30s and 40s. So that issue was very much at the heart, I think, of this divide between the Black and Jewish communities that, you know, when I was a young radical growing up in between the 60s and the 70s, it was really hard for us to figure out where were all these, why was it that all these really heroic Jewish communists who had, you know, fought in Spain against fascism, who had gone south with the Freedom Riders, had represented the Rosenbergs, were representing the unions, why were they supporting Israel? And a lot of it had to do with those questions of class, as well as some of the international questions about who supported Israel's creation and all of that. But in the US, that alliance was so much an internal alliance within groups of poor people. And suddenly when one of them was not any longer poor, the alliance was shattered to a large degree.
Thank you, Phyllis. Esti, I wanted to ask you about where you see opinion in the Jewish community among American Jews, especially younger people going. You mentioned Peter Beinart. We've seen his transformation over the years, which has been incredible. He's now basically calling for Palestinians to be able to return to their lands. What do you ascribe, I don't know if you know him personally, but what do you ascribe to sort of that shift happening? And how do you see kind of younger people's opinions changing? And just overall, Israeli advocate groups, claim that the majority of Jewish Americans support Israel. Do you agree with that? Yeah. How are you seeing the sort of the overall picture?
Thank you, Leila. Yeah, I mean, besides us seeing a shift, Israel sees a shift. Israel sees the shift in younger Jews who all the polling shows, I mean, all Jewish Americans, we see a shift, an immense shift from younger generations, and for the same reasons, because they're in their schools, in their colleges, with their friends. They don't have the same kinds of seeing people as different or any kind of tolerance for the treatment of people, as lesser than or as different. And so really it's that shift, I think, that is seeping up into political circles and political advocacy. I was just part of Jewish Voice for Peace Action's Lobby Week, which is, we've been doing this for 4 or 5 years now. We had over 250 people in over 70 meetings with congressional representatives, their advisors, their staffers, and you see a great shift in the perception. We see totally different questions being asked of, members of the Progressive Caucus who just a year or two ago, weren't asking the same kinds of, prescient questions, now are asking Palestinians in our meetings, what do you think is the solution? People who believe in the two-state solution saying, this is what I believed in, but I feel like I need to rethink, what's possible. And I want to know honestly from you how you feel about it. So we do see this shift, and I do think it is being driven by the younger generations having no tolerance for it, the Sunrise Movement now being part of the coalition, and all the polling showing that not only are the attitudes and perceptions of what exactly is going on in Israel-Palestine perceived of differently by young people, but also, more and more by progressives and Democratic voters. And that's a good thing, because the intersectionality of the oppression is being very, very clearly understood. And, we need to keep being out there informing and giving the tools and encouraging people to reach out and to communicate with their elected officials often, because they are counting those calls, those emails, those letters.
Thank you. Iran, my question to you is if you can tell us a bit more about the 1033 program. And also, I think for many Americans, but especially for Black Americans, their experience with US police has been one of, brutality, racial profiling, obviously murder of unarmed people, and impunity. What exactly are they learning when they go to Israel? Because, we know that as far as US policing, there's a long history of all these things I mentioned. So if you can kind of put that into context.
Yes, thank you for this question. So first of all, the 1033, to whoever doesn't know, and I'm sure there's on this panel right now, there's more than one person that can probably do this work better than me in explaining it. But 1033 program is a program that started during the 90s under the Clinton administration that basically manifest a movement of shipment of weapons from the military into the hands of local police departments, local law enforcement across the country. Now, the program grew incidentally after post 9/11. It reached departments across the country that were so small that they had to start giving away weapons to volunteers to take home because they didn't know what to do with the new toys that they received. And the 1033 program, among a few other programs, changed the way police work. So, of course, police was always this racial project in the United States that targeted people of color, communities that seek racial justice in the United States, and served to protect the elites, served to protect a certain level of people in the United States and the power. But with programs like the 1033 program, the regular policing that we understood as policing, the regular police officers that look like police officers, and they could do all the damage that police officers are doing today, now are doing it dressed and equipped as a military, as a fighting military abroad. And they're treating citizens in the United States, again, like something that is going on for about 200 years, but now with the capabilities, the technologies, the equipment, treating them like a foreign enemy. That means that every department in the United States that are receiving this equipment and want to keep the equipment will want to expand different departments or different areas in the department rather than others. So if you have regular patrol police in a certain department, it will probably diminish in order to get more squads that are dealing with, for example, drugs offenses across the United States. Because with the new equipment that you have, the SWATs can break into homes in the middle of the night, like Israel will do in Palestine, and will arrest, detain, some cases kill people in their homes for minor offenses. Now, part of the reason they're doing it is that this equipment is not only new shiny toys for the police officers, it's also worth a lot of money to the department. And the US government, the federal government, is also given an incentive to the departments to use the weapon in the first 12 months after receiving them, and tell them if they will not use the weapons, it can be taken away and be given to a different department in a different place of the country. And that is part of the reason of why we're seeing in recent years more and more armored vehicles, tanks, grenade launchers, helicopters, grenades in the hands of police officers that are coming to suppress protests, any civil unrest, and also to make arrests and to separate communities, to do drug busts, etc. Now, part of what the 1033 program is changing in the landscape of what we knew before is that it makes the US policing similar to the Israeli military, in that it becomes its own industry of its own. If weapons that are shifting now, for example, from Iraq and Afghanistan, with the dwelling down of the forces in those occupied areas, with the promise that by 9/11 of 2021, the forces will be out, the shift of many of the companies that are manufacturing the weapons is changing. And it's changing to places like Palestine, like Israel, to continue working with the Israeli government. And it's also shifting into local police departments in the hope that the police department will fill some of the gap for those weapon companies around the world. So that's about the 1033. I apologize. What was the second question?
It was just about putting it in perspective, given sort of the long history of police brutality, especially against Black communities. What are American police actually learning in Israel?
Right. Thank you. So I think what is most appealing, there's two things I will touch. The first is that one of the most appealing things that happen in Israel is that you have a full industry working together. So as I said earlier, police do not need to learn how to be racist or violent. They do not need to learn how to do a chokehold or how to shoot a gun. All of the things happen in the United States long before the establishment of Israel. But in Israel, you have a full industry that is working for the security apparatus, beginning with citizens all the way to the government through the media, police, military, Shin Bet, secret agents, the prison complex in Israel. All of them are united into this mission. I think one of the things that is fascinating in talking to police officers that are coming back to the US after being on these trips is their envy of how Israel is functioning as a security state. They see it as a model they want to bring back to the United States, something that is, of course, very dangerous and trying to take back, to peel back works of years of social movements and activists in the United States, of the courts, of lawyers in the United States. So in this full apparatus of all the powers working together, one additional status that I think is very coveted is that Israel is doing it as a democracy. And that goes back to what Phyllis has talked about before and what Esti mentioned. Israel doing it as a liberal democracy accepted in the world, but running an apartheid regime over millions of people. That idea that the United States can go to Israel, the police officers can go to Israel and learn how to have a security apparatus which is so repressive, that is envious to the police officers that want to try it, want to try all the new toys and all the new weaponry, but also know that they are the good guys. Israel is reflecting back to the US that this is a counterterrorism, this is a security measures. In many ways, Israel is taking a colonial problem and transforming it into a security one for the rest of the world. And that, much more than any specific tactic or technology, is what is so fascinating for police departments all over the world, and specifically US law enforcement when coming to Israel.
Thank you so much. I have like 10 questions for each of you left, but unfortunately we do need to wrap it up. So I was just going to ask each panelist to give their closing, some final closing thoughts, starting with Phyllis.
Wow, this has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you for bringing us together, Layla, Sammy, the rest of you. And thanks to the translators. This was not an easy one to keep up, I think. I would just say that we're in a very strange moment. We're in a moment when the world is still much in lockdown because of the pandemic, when the impact of these rising horrific numbers of illness and death around the world is shaping the lives of so many people. Not so much here in the United States anymore. It's beginning to come out of that, but that's a question of privilege and not something that exists in the rest of the world. On the question of Palestine, we see we're coming out of this extraordinary 2-month period of an explosion of activity and repression, resistance, and the conditions are getting worse and worse on the ground for Palestinians. At the very moment that we can look here in the United States, in the belly of the beast that's the most responsible for preventing Palestinian victories, and see how the discourse is so dramatically changing. And we know that our democracy is flawed and it's not sufficient, so that public opinion, when it changes, ends up changing public policy. It doesn't work that way. But it is a necessary precondition to changing the policy. It's not a guarantee, it's not sufficient, but we have to have that change in the discourse before we can expect any kind of real change of US policy. And that's where we're seeing some extraordinary victories. And it seems almost, I don't even know what the right word is, it seems wrong. And it's certainly humbling to think that we can even say that something here is a victory on the question of Palestinian rights when Palestinian suffering is so extreme. But that is the moment that we face. And it's up to us, I think, to take those moments of at least partial victories and turn them into something that will make it possible for Palestinians to see that victory in their own liberation on the ground.
I also want to thank you all for Layla and Semi and everyone and the interpreters for inviting me. So it's a very rich discussion, and I think I would echo what Phyllis said, and I would add that I've been very heartened by hearing some of the strands and the threads, particularly around the South African anti-apartheid movement and how it embeds, what lessons we can learn for thinking about Palestine today, my political awakening was as a college student doing anti-apartheid work in the context of South Africa. And I have to think that even though there's a new generation of folks that are doing thinking, and as we talked about, really are not satisfied with the status quo, I also think that in the longer arc of the work, the efforts that we're making now, even though you're right, you can't call them victories in the context of the great suffering that is happening, that Palestinian people are suffering even today, that apartheid, you can't litigate yourself out of apartheid. And at some level, that you have to shift beliefs and orientation towards the problem. The problem definition is really the key here. And the good news is that we're not defining this problem by a balancing act. We're beginning to define this problem as a core human rights issue that is untenable, that is unacceptable, but is solvable if the political if there is political will to do so. And the demands around political will are very fierce. And that gives me great hope for the shifts. I can feel it. If you've been in the work long enough, you can begin to sense some of these shifts, and it can be a bit jarring and very exciting. And our job is to recognize them and to build on them, to educate people about them, and to continue that work towards these shifts so that we can actually say, Palestine is free, and we know what that means, and we know what that looks like, and Palestinians know what that means and knows what it looks like. Thank you.
Yeah, and I agree. To the points that Phyllis made, and to the points that Vince made about this reframing being very important. And just even in the last few weeks, as things here in Southern California have opened up, the numbers of requests for in-person presentations. There is a thirst for learning more, that people are putting these pieces together. And, as was said, it's the only way we're going to change the political landscape of what's possible is through their voters, because that's what people care about. They care about their constituents, and that's who they're listening to. And the more that we can educate, activate, and motivate, and fulfill the thirst for people to understand this, the more we will be able to activate them into making those calls and being ever present and explaining to our elected officials, who are supposed to represent us, how we want to be represented to create the changes that we're seeing and hearing, and to grow that small troop of champions in Congress into a larger troop. And importantly now, to start trying to do the same thing with the Senate, who can block everything. And in this case in particular, important to also be talking to the administration, to the White House, because we see with things like that letter of all those supporters, we need to help those people to make that point.
So first of all, I want to echo the thanks to you, Leila, and to Sami and this incredible panel. It was indeed an honor. I think that if there's one question that we in the U.S. movement for justice in Palestine and the U.S.-based left in general don't ask as much as we should be, maybe, is who are the corporate forces of the military-industrial complex, and how are they shaping the terrain of our struggle? Which military operations are they behind and profiting from? And how are they shaping U.S. diplomacy and military aid to Israel and U.S. Policy towards Israel in general, everything that this panel have covered. And I think that to trace how U.S. taxpayer funds are moving to private U.S. weapon corporation through the support for Israel. Because for many years now, I think that our movement touched about how the taxpayers and how Americans specifically are paying Israel or given money to the state of Israel or the military in Israel. But I don't think that we touch enough about who's profiting here in the US and how to stop it here in home. I think when we come to research and build our campaigns, we shouldn't start abroad. I think Phil's touched on it earlier. I think that we rather need to look much more closely at home at campaigns like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, CTS, organized locally everywhere in the world, around the headquarters and the factories, in our backyard, around our governments, like Esti has alluded to. This past operation, we managed to delay a Boeing shipments of weapons during the operation that was on its way, bombs that were on their way to Gaza. And we managed to stop them, not because we just sharing images from Gaza and talking about how terrible it is, but because we are trying to take responsibility back at home. And I think that often we want to start from the end result and then go backwards instead of researching and working around the next move and starting right here at home. So here's my wish for this coming year: transforming US foreign policy, working on Congress, working on all the legal issues and challenges ahead of us with this incredible panel. And I promise that I will be there as well, doing my best to work from the US and to free Palestine.
Thank you all so much. This was really amazing. I echo what you all said. I know I learned so much, and I'm sure our audience did as well. I know that Professor Samuel Arian, the director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, just has a quick announcement to make before we wrap up. Thank you again. Or sorry, I guess Uwais is going to make that announcement.
Thank you very much for all the participants, and I want to thank all of those who put this panel together. Tomorrow we have 2 sessions. Session 9, which is Reversing Apartheid, the Role of Law, Politics, Economics, and Popular Mobilization. And then at 8 p.m., we have Session 10, which is the Future of the Palestinian Struggle. I invite all of the viewers to join us again tomorrow. And once again, from CIGA, I want to extend my thanks to Mrs. Leila Al-Arian for moderating such a wonderful session. And my final thanks to all of the panel members and all the viewers. Good night from Istanbul.